Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I'm a Greek philosopher. You're going to find out why later. Today, I am on with Dr. Joel Anderson and surprise, surprise, Kinham. Ha ha ha!
Oh my gosh.
Surprise, surprise. What is going on here? Because we are talking about Joel's book, The Heresy of Ham. And you heard that right. Heresy and him connected together. We're going to talk about that and Dr. Henderson has some pretty insightful thoughts on how Ken Ham operates, the arguments he makes, and the topic of young Earth creationism in general. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Anderson?
Uh, I'm waking up. I'm trying to wake up. A little scruffy all around, but gotta do it.
We're getting the real morning you today.
Yeah.
And okay, so you just came out with the second edition
Yep.
of
Plug.
a book you made. Yes, The
There it
Heresy
is.
of Ham.
Lovely
Uh,
cover.
Beautiful.
Yes.
So, could you just give us a 5-minute summary of the views you talked about in that book, what you argued?
Okay. Sure. I give you an overview. If anybody has read the first edition, the bulk of it's obviously the same. Uh, Basically, what I do in the book, I'll kind of take you bird's eye view over the whole thing. It begins with a little story of how I got in trouble at a small Christian school at which I taught over the creation evolution debate. Um, Basically, there was a new headmaster, and he was a fervent young Earth creationist. At that time, I didn't really care much about the issue, but I didn't believe Ken Ham, but it was no big deal. Anyway, he and a local pastor kind of teamed up and made sure I wasn't there at the school anymore. So it was kind of a shock. And then because of that, I started researching Ken Ham to make sense of why I lost my job over something that I thought was kind of an insignificant thing. And the more I researched Ken Ham, the more I realized this is really, well, straight up crazy. But a real threat to the faith of a lot of Christians, a lot of evangelical Christians who've grown up kind of a more of a conservative world, like I did. It has a really negative influence on it. And so what I did in the book, the whole book is not just about Ken Ham. It's actually the first 6 chapters lays the groundwork so that you can better understand the issues around this debate. And so after that little brief introduction of what happened to me, I tell the story of Arianism, a brief story about Arianism in the 4th century. That was like the first major heresy that threatened the Christian faith. And my point is that heresy is always either a denial of some of what I call the creedal fundamentals. Think of the Nicene Creed. Those are the bare bones non-negotiables of the faith. If you don't believe in the resurrection, sorry, you're not a Christian. You don't think Jesus was incarnated, that's a kind of a big deal. You can't get away with that. But what heresy does, it either denies some of those basic fundamentals, or it adds something to them, elevates a non-fundamental issue to a fundamental issue. And in the case of Arianism, that threatened the faith in the 4th century. So I tell the story about that. And then I talk about the importance of church tradition and the creeds. Now, I grew up in an Assemblies of God, evangelical home. I'm now have become Orthodox primarily, well, for a lot of reasons, but primarily because I love the idea that they focus on the core teachings. Everything else you can disagree on, but the Orthodox Church their goal is to preserve the teachings that Christ handed down to his apostles, those creedal fundamentals. And so the importance of church tradition and understanding early church history is it helps you keep that in mind. Know what the main important creedal fundamentals of the faith are, and then what isn't. And so I talk about the importance of that. And the reason that's important is because when it comes to like the creation evolution debate or how to interpret Genesis 1 through 11, that issue, when you look at various church fathers and theologians throughout church history, many of them had different views on how to interpret it, but they all understood that particular issue of, is Genesis 1 through 11 historical? Is it literal 7 days or not? That was never considered a fundamental of the faith. Christians disagreed on it, and that was okay. Okay. But that was not on the same level of, I believe in the resurrection. And so in the book, I talk about, that's why church tradition is important. I talk about how, Genesis 1 through 11 has been interpreted throughout history. And then I have a little chapter where I give a mini lesson on what they call biblical exegesis, how to properly interpret the Bible. You have to take into the historical context, the literary context is important. And after that, I give my mini commentary on Genesis 1 through 11, how I read it. Only after that, that's like the first 6 chapters. After I lay the groundwork of all that, I then start talking about Ken Ham and young earth creationism. In light of everything I say in the first 6 chapters, I then, for the next few chapters, just take the reader by the hand and go through various things he's written in his books and his blogs, his debate with Bill Nye, the science guy, in 2014. And I go through all of the young earth creationists, not all of them, but many of the young earth creationist claims to show, how illogical and bizarre they are, but also how Ken Ham and a lot of young earth creationists, they make these core tenets of the faith and they start attacking other Christians on whether or not they believe in a young earth. They're not a real Christian. I'm not going to say they're not a real Christian, but they're not a real Christian. That's kind of what you get a lot of times in their writings. And so after I do that, I end the book, the original book. Then I look at the early church father, Irenaeus, who was early 2nd century. And I look specifically at the way he wrote about the Adam and Eve story and whether or not he believed they were historical. He was definitely interpreting them, that story, in a different way than Ken Ham does. And all of that is to say, when you get through my book, hopefully you see that when it comes to the issue of creation evolution and how to interpret, Genesis 1, is that is the evolution is not a threat to the faith. It should not impact how you interpret Genesis 1 through 11 at all. And that's one of the things that often gets muddied. If you talk to a lot of young earth creationists, they seem to think that the only reason you interpret Genesis 1 through 11 is not historical is you're just trying to smuggle evolution in. It's like, I came to my conclusion about Genesis 1 through 11 10 years before I ever looked in the evolution debate. And I was just basing it on my background, graduate background stuff is in biblical studies, just trying to understand Genesis 1 through 11 in its historical and literary context and how it functions within Genesis. I came to my conclusion about that. Evolution had nothing to do with how I interpreted it. But unfortunately, in this debate, both young earth creationists and a lot of people on the other side, they give the impression that evolution, causes us, we need to reinterpret Genesis 1 through 11. And I want to say, no, you don't. You interpret Genesis 1 through 11 based on Genesis 1 through 11 and how it is written. Evolution is completely irrelevant to it. And so then after that, after I end there, I add some chapters at the end in my revised edition, more humorous chapters, where I talk a little bit more about what happened to me that final year at my school. And then about a visit I took to an AIG conference, Answers in Genesis conference, and I heard Ken Ham speak, and I even got my picture with him. And then my visit to the Ark Encounter in the Creation Museum. And you see up front exactly what is in these places. And it's just, well, it's sad if you take it too seriously, but it's just funny. The bizarre claims made. And I think a lot of evangelicals don't really understand just some of the bizarre claims that young earth creationists make. It's most evangelicals, and this is one of the things I wanted to get across in that chapter about my last year at the school, most of the teachers I worked with would not have said they believed evolution, and that's fine. But when they found out more about what young earth creationists and Ken Ham taught, they were kind of astounded, because most of the time, most evangelicals probably, if they know about Ken Ham, they just think, oh, he's just, supporting the Bible and against atheism. It's like, he's a little more than that. And when you actually tell them some of the things he claims, they kind of step back and they're like, wait a second, what? Because most people don't know. And so the purpose of those last few chapters is to take you on a tour of the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter, and just show you how crazy some of the claims are. And then at the very end, I have one more chapter about kind of like where I see how things have changed over the last 8 years since my first, since the Heresy of Ham first came out. And I do think there has been some positive advances within evangelicalism, more willing to engage in the discussion about how to interpret Genesis 1-11 and the creation evolution issue. People, some people have kind of backed off on how they're not as militant as they used to be. There still are some, obviously, but anyway, that's a 8-minute overview of my book. So
That's okay. We'll make it up for it in other questions.
Yeah. I didn't want to give it a big overview. So if anybody's wanting to get it,
right.
I think there's a lot there. It's more than just Ken Ham's idiot. It's, in fact, it's more about you learn about church history a little more. You learn about what the core tenets of the faith really are. And then you learn about how to interpret the Bible. You get those tools so you can, understand them. And then you're in a better place to analyze what guys like Ken Ham says and analyze that issue.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about this whole heresy topic, because Heresy of Ham, that seems pretty polemical. So could you talk about, just in general, what is heresy? You quoted from a Christian scholar that defines heresy. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, basically my excuse me, still the morning. My take on heresy is, like I said earlier, it's either one of two things. It is either denying some of the major tenets put forth in the creeds, because those are the major things, or it is elevating the secondary issue to that level of a creedal fundamental. Yeah. And so in this case, the heresy of Ham is not, oh, he believes the earth is only 6,000 years old. Okay, a lot of Christians believe that. I think they're wrong, but they just have a different opinion. That's not the heresy part. The heresy is when you say the earth is 6,000 years old, you must interpret Genesis 1-11 literally. And if you don't, when you're a supposed Christian who probably, if Genesis 1-11 isn't historical, then the resurrection isn't either. You elevate it, and then everything gets out of whack, and you end up creating division and a lot of rancor among Christians, because you are elevating something that is not a main issue to a main issue, and you're defining your whole faith by that issue, and it never has been in the Christian, in the history of Christianity. So for me, that's how I define heresy. It's either one or two things: denying one of the creedal fundamentals, or adding to it. And when you do that, that creates problems. And that's exactly what you see going on with a lot of young earth creationists like Ken Ham. On one hand, they'll say it's not a fundamental. I mean, I'm not saying it's a fundamental, but they really do,
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. That was a pretty interesting chapter or section of your book that you it's like on one hand, Ken Ham will say, hey, yeah, it's not, you don't have to believe, young earth creationism to be a Christian or whatever. But also, if you do, you're giving up Bible authority. You're undermining the entire Bible. Basic Christianity is false if you do believe it. But it's like, so which one is it?
Well, and it's funny. There's one blog post he wrote that I highlighted where it's complete doublespeak. He's like, I'm not saying young earth creationism, belief in a young earth is a salvation issue. I mean, you could, it's not a salvation issue. It's a biblical authority issue. And the Bible tells us about salvation. So in a way, it is about itself. And you're like, come on. When people equivocate that much, you know there's something up. Like they're
Right.
trying to like make it work, and it just doesn't. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
So for people that care about like the understanding the Bible in its context, there's this whole conversation in this topic of like, hey, we got to read the Bible like as the ancient readers would have read it.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult topic for a lot of people because
Yeah.
we don't have these extra biblical texts of how they actually read the text most of the time,
Yeah.
especially in the Hebrew Bible, like the flood, Genesis, all
Yeah.
that. So a lot of times scholars will look at other texts from outside the Bible, these other nations like Egypt or Babylon or whatever,
Mhm.
and naturally they're going to be having like, essentially like pagan myths, stuff like that.
Yep.
So could you just quickly talk about why you don't see that as a big problem about reading the flood text, the Genesis text in general,
Mhm.
with in mind of like that context of these pagan myths?
Okay. Well, yeah, one of like the fundamental rules of biblical exegesis or biblical interpretation is you want to try the best you can as a modern reader to read the given passage or the given text in its original historical context. So, if you were reading Ephesians, how was the Ephesian church reading, understanding what Paul was telling them in the first century? You have to see it from their eyes as best you can. So that's with everything in the Bible. When it comes to Genesis 1 through 11, it's the kind of literature that it is so foreign to us. We have a hard time interpreting it. And since we are a post, after the Enlightenment scientific revolution, people in the West, we think it's natural to come to Genesis 1 through 11 and assume that it is talking about scientific, historical, factual things, because that's what we do, right? And so to get in the head of an ancient Near Eastern Israelite, so to speak, it's really hard to do because we're not ancient Near Eastern Israelites. But like you said, we have a lot of other literature from the ancient world that helps us understand what Genesis 1 through 11, the flood story, is about. And and this gets into understanding the not just the historical context, but the literary context of certain passages in Genesis 1 through 11. It's a section. It's a clear section in and of itself. And I argue in the book that Genesis 1 through 11 is an example of the genre of ancient Near Eastern mythology. Now, when I say that, a lot of people think myth, you're saying it's a fairy tale, blah, 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 blah. We're talking about actual genre, like if it's a poem, is it a parable, is it history, is it, epistle? Myth was a specific genre of literature that they used in the ancient world where they expressed their beliefs about the gods. Obviously, most polytheistic pagans would have gods, plural, what they think human beings are and what they think the natural world is. And so, but myths are not trying to give historical scientific details. That's the first thing. When you realize that, then when you come to Genesis 1 through 11, and for example, the flood story, you realize that maybe it's not trying to talk about scientific historical facts. If it's written in this other genre, we have to interpret it along that other genre. And so, for example, let's just take the flood story. The Noah story in Genesis 6 through 9 is very similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a Mesopotamian flood story. And when you put them side by side, there's a lot of similarities narratively. I mean, there are obviously differences. The size of the boats are different and certain things are different. But the story itself is pretty much the same kind of flood. Because flow is a water. I made a joke. And so when you get to the flood story, what you want to ask yourself then is this flood story exactly promoting the same kind of worldview as the Epic of Gilgamesh and other ancient Near Eastern flood stories, or what's different about it? And this is where the differences do not, I mean, there are differences in the details, some of the details, but the significant differences are in what the flood story is teaching, theologically, so to speak. And so when you look at these other flood stories, the situation, and I'm being very just general here, the situation that brings about the flood in these other ancient Near Eastern myths often is the gods are trying to get to sleep, and the humans down on the earth are just being too loud. And so the gods say, let's kill them all. Okay. Now, right there, if you are an ancient Near Eastern person, not an Israelite, but a pagan, what is that part of this flood story telling you? What is it teaching you? It is teaching you that the gods are psychotic and you don't love them. They're dangerous. And that human beings are so insignificant that they could wipe them out because they're pieces of crap, basically, right? Then you look at the Noah's story. It's a very different, the cause of the flood is very different.
Yeah.
In the Noah story, there's one God, who the creator, and the reason he brings the flood is not because human beings are too loud. It's because human beings have become so sinful and have corrupted his good creation. So in Genesis, the flood is a way of demonstrating God's justice dealing with evil. Whereas in these other myths, it's just the gods are psychotic. They'll wipe you out if you piss them off. So right there, that is theologically, that's teaching two different things. Obviously, one God, not many. Good God, not psychopath gods. And then but the story itself, it sounds the same. There's a flood that covers the world. Only a small group of people are survive. But what it's teaching about God or the gods is very different. And that's the significance. And you can go through everything in Genesis 1 through 11. And when you contrast it with other things in the ancient Near Eastern mythological writings, you pick that up time and time again. What makes Genesis 1 through 11, I believe as a Christian, true and inspired is not that it gets the details of history right. It's using this genre to communicate truths about who God is. You can go to Genesis, the creation account in Genesis 1. Most other myths, again, there's one God who defeats another god, like Marduk kills the sea monster Tiamat. And then out of Tiamat's corpse, he creates the earth. So the message to human beings are, you live on a corpse, and then let's create human beings out of the excrement of the loser god. So that teaches, people, you are pieces of crap. You contrast that with what you get in Genesis 1. There's a single God, a good God who creates everything, says it's good. It's not a corpse. It's a good creation. And then he creates human beings in his image, and they have dignity and worth. When you compare the Genesis 1 through 11 stories with the ancient Near Eastern myth stories, you realize that the theology and the worldview is very different. It's the same genre, but it's very different. And that's where I think Genesis 1 through 11 is inspired and true. Not that it's getting scientific historical details right, but it's telling us the truth about who God is.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
So I could clarify some things.
Yeah.
So people often say, like, someone like Ken Ham will say, like, hey, you're giving your authority to these other ancient texts, not the Bible. But that's just not true. We're just trying to understand the text and how the ancient reader would understand it. Someone like Moses or the people in Babylon or whatever would have known about these other texts.
Yeah.
That's just pretty much a fact. Okay.
Right.
So we have to understand how they would have been reading it, why it would have been written.
Yeah.
And so
I'll
think,
give you the
Sure.
really easy example.
Okay.
Let's say you're an ancient Israelite and somebody reads to you or tells you Genesis 1. Okay. The ancient Israelites would not be hearing that and thinking, oh, wow, this refutes Darwinism. That is awesome. No, because they're familiar with these stories in their culture, they would hear Genesis 1, and the first thing they would pop into their head is like, there's one God, not many, and it's a good creation, and we have dignity and worth because we're made in his image. That's how they would have interpreted. Those are the things they would have picked up on because they would have been familiar with these other stories. And as modern people, we need to read those texts like they did. And so when Ken Ham says, oh, you're giving authority to these other myths, like, no, you're not. You're just trying to read the biblical text in the ancient context so you understand what the inspired meaning is. Like I got when I was in graduate school, Gordon Fee, he always emphasized that the inspired meaning of a given biblical text is what was being relayed to that original audience. You know, it's not, oh, it's inspired, I can make the text mean whatever I want it to mean. You have to ask yourself, what was the original message given to that original audience? That's the inspired meaning. That's important. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I think what's really fascinating about this conversation is like, so Ken Ham and his group will be like, hey, so you're giving the authority to these other texts, therefore we shouldn't listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
But that also means that they completely miss all of the similarities, all the conversation that's happening. So it's like, if the original text is something that was written in response to these other texts, they would have no way of knowing it. They just completely just close their eyes to all of the evidence for that.
Yeah.
And it's just like it's a really interesting conversation there.
It's why the context is so important. And and this is what young Earth creationists do, they strip away all that. Well, you throw the context out, then how do you interpret Genesis 1 through 11? They knowingly, then they interpret it along the terms of modern science, and they got to fit with modern science. Like, no, the original context is important.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, on a similar note, something that I come across whenever we have these topics is someone will say like, oh, the biblical text, that is like the true non-distorted version.
Yeah.
So, Noah took this tradition of the flood and he took it off the ark because
he wrote it down.
Experienced it. He wrote it down, or maybe it was an oral tradition. And he passed it down to the people at the Tower of Babel when everybody was together. And at that point, that's when everything went bad, and all these other myths of creation texts and flood myths, they started changing the story as it got passed down. So we have the real true historical one, and the other ones are the fake one. Like, could you talk about why you think that's just so improbable?
Well, again, it's because I believe everything in Genesis 1 through 11 is not meant to be historical to begin with. But the Tower of Babel thing, I read, when Ken Ham talks about it, he's like, the one that's in our Bibles, the Noah, the flood accounts are probably, that's the right one that got all the facts right, that was preserved well. Gilgamesh, there's just outlandish, crazy things in that one. It's clearly a myth. And you're like, how could I don't know how to explain it. It's like, if you're interpreting either one in terms of historical factuality, they both sound pretty out there. All the animals coming into an ark, but the idea that the flood myths all came from Babel and they were distorted, but the Jews kept on the right one. Well, the easiest answer would be, where's your evidence of that? There's no evidence of that's where they all came from. But again, when you have this mentality, when you interpret Genesis 1 through 11 as if it were strict history, you have to account for things, and you end up forcing things into that small little timeline. And so, I mean, if we're going to talk about some of the crazy other claims that Ham makes related to the Tower of Babel, might as well throw them in here now. He also says, again, in his timeline, the flood happened roughly 4,000 BC. Okay. No. That was creation in 4,000 BC. My bad. The flood was roughly 2,300 BC. And then in his timeline, in the young Earth creationist timeline, Noah gets off the ark with the animals and the dinosaurs, and then within the next 300 years, up by the time you get to Abraham, there's one singular ice age that lasted for 70 years, where all the dinosaurs died. And after the Tower of Babel, when all the people split off, there was one group who got so cut off from the rest of humanity and so isolated that they literally developed their own genome and became the Neanderthals 4,000 years ago. And then they made their way back to humanity, interbred with the rest of humans, and then they died out all within 300 years. Anybody who makes that kind of claim, and then he says, oh, and the flood story is the historically correct one, and you can't take that person seriously. If they're making those kind of outrageous claims, I'm sorry, they don't have any credibility. So
yeah, the scientific aspects of this conversation is not something I'm an expert in, but it's pretty wild to think about. You also mentioned in your book a couple things that were really important. I think you mentioned that the ancestors of Abraham. So before God comes onto the scene, Abraham is not like some Christian or Yahweh worshiper. Okay, so like he is pagan. His ancestors were pagan, but somehow they were perfectly preserving like the pure text, the actual historical event. So like why it just doesn't make any sense why they would be preserving that when they didn't even believe in God or Yahweh to begin with, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Then of course there's the question of evidence. Like it's just pure speculation.
Yeah.
Based off of an odd reading of the text, which is completely ambiguous. And then it's like, well, it could have happened that way, but like, why would anybody base anything off of it could have happened that way, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things you find if you go to the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum on most of their displays about all this speculation. There's a lot of could-haves, would-haves, and maybes in the way they describe everything.
Yeah.
Like, for example, Noah could have gone to shipwright school in the pre-flood civilization. That's how he learned to build the ark. It's just like everything is speculative. And that's one of the, to me, one of the funniest things about Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis. Their supposed goal is to argue for the scientific and historical accuracy of Genesis 1 through 11. But when you go to their displays at the Ark Encounter, everything they put forth to prove the historical accuracy is literally fiction. Like there's Noah went to shipwright school. That is fiction. There's no evidence of that. Ham was originally a big game hunter in the, pre-flood world. And then he met his wife who was in the medical field. You're like,
what?
Where do you get this? But they have, this is what it could have been like. So your entire thing to prove the historicity of it is fiction. And I think you undermine Genesis 1 through 11, because unfortunately, a lot of atheists and non-believers will look at Ken Ham and think not just that he's weird in his interpretations of it, they're then going to think, oh, therefore Genesis 1 through 11 is stupid, when they're just reacting to his bad interpretation of it. I mean, Genesis 1, he is right in one thing. Genesis 1 through 11 is really important to understand the rest of the Bible. It sets the stage for a lot of fundamental theological truths that play out. But because he insists they must be straight up history, he ends up elevating Genesis 1 through 11 to be mocked by non-believers, basically. And then they think all of Christianity is stupid because of what the false information he's putting out there.
Yeah.
Kind of like the name of the Lord is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, kind of thing. Yeah. And it's true, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah. Some other things that I thought were mentioning there as well is you talked about how for one, the Epic of Gilgamesh, texts like that, they clearly predate the biblical text. When we just look at the evidence, okay, then you have the Genesis text was like as we have it today,
Mhm.
was very clearly written not at the time of the narrative. Like
Right.
the Genesis text has so many obvious things that everybody agrees about. I mean,
Mhm.
like Hebrew didn't even exist at the
Yeah.
time. So whatever text we have today was not the exact same thing as before. So Ham's theory like requires that the text was never changed at all. It was just simply translated,
Yeah.
and they just added a few details here and there. But of course, why would you ever think that that type of writing? People just didn't do that at the time.
Yeah.
Additionally, this was really fascinating. You talked about how it was a misunderstanding of how ancient oral tradition works. So
Mhm.
Like Ken Ham, assumes oral traditions are inherently unreliable and prone to corruption.
Right.
In reality, oral cultures maintain accuracy through communal knowledge and structured storytelling practices. So, for example, if someone at one time period like changes a story, the whole culture that they're in is going to know about it. Like
Yeah.
we also have these other cultures or the same story. So there, it's not like, I mean, yes, things happened over time,
Yeah.
but it's not going to be like these just like radical shifts in the story. Is that a good way to say it?
Yeah. I mean, I think an easier kind of a nice illustration would be you just think of like if a group of people like in America, let's like think of some really famous singer or that everybody knows the lyrics to a certain song. If I get up and I start messing up the lyrics, say everybody in the crowd is going to know that I messed it up. You know, so that's kind of what oral tradition does. If everybody is familiar with it, and then somebody says something out of line, people are going to call you on it. You're like, oh, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. So oral tradition is not necessarily, um, it's not unreliable, especially in cultures that are oral cultures. Now, in our culture where we write everything down, therefore we don't exercise our memories as well.
Mm,
That's why modern people can't remember things all the times because we don't have to, you know. But in an ancient culture where most people were not literate, meaning they couldn't read and write, but they were an oral auditory culture, they were able to remember and recall things a lot better
yeah.
than we do. And so, but yeah, so when Ken Ham goes, "Oh, they unreliable. Oral tradition is unreliable." It's kind of a modern elitism. Oh, since I can't do it, they probably couldn't do it. Like maybe
Mm,
they were better at it than you, you
mm,
know. But yeah,
yeah.
Genesis 1 through 11, I think acts as a prologue to not just Genesis but the whole Bible. And you know, typically in scholarship, the general idea is that a bulk of what we have in the Old Testament was compiled, not just written. Well, it was compiled probably during the Babylonian exile. Okay, Jewish scribes once the Judeans got sent into Babylon, they
Mm,
were in exile, and how did we get here? I thought we worshiped the one true God and we were his people. How did we end up in exile?
mm,
And then the Jewish scribes would go back in their records and they compiled what we have now, I think from Genesis to Second Kings. They didn't write it fresh then. They were compiling stuff they had. And so I think when you look at that stuff, Genesis 1 through 11 kind of sets up the foundation to understand their predicament. God created a good creation. Mankind is an image. And then you get to Abraham. He was going to create a special people through whom he
mm,
can bless all nations. We were that people and we screwed up, you know? And so Genesis 1 through 11 acts as a prologue to all that. And so I
yeah.
think it makes sense because by the time you get to the Tower of Babel, it shouldn't be surprised that it's the Tower of Babel, because when it was compiled and constructed in the way we have it, the Jews were in Babylon. How did we end up here? So there's a lot of literary things going on there that would make sense.
Right, right.
But
And
yeah,
we just have no reason to think that they wouldn't have, even if they had a earlier text, that we just have no reason to think that they wouldn't have updated that slightly to tailor to their situation better.
Yeah,
Like, it's not like these are just like random historical documents. We're just going to throw it in there because
no,
we're trying to keep our history together. That just didn't exist at the time.
yeah. Well, and like I think the ancient creation and flood myths, it's not like they had like a single text that they worked on. These were just in the atmosphere of the ancient world. You know, everybody knew them,
Yeah.
and so the writers. I don't think the writers of the biblical writers were like had an ancient text of the Gilgamesh flood. Like, oh, I'm going to change it. It's like they knew the story, and they're writing their story. You know, to explicate their own
Yeah.
worldviews and their the Jewish beliefs about God and stuff.
Mhm. Right. Right. So a big thing that Ham wants to focus on is the idea that like these other traditions are essentially like changing, like the texts are being changed because just naturally oral tradition is going to change it, and the historical aspects are going to change. But you pointed out that a lot of these things are not just simply historical accurate type of points. Like, for example, the difference is that like the text of the Gilgamesh epic is very polytheistic,
Yeah,
while the Yahweh tradition, the Genesis text is not. Like, that's not something that just like gets changed due to
yeah,
oral tradition messing up and not
yeah.
passing it down correctly.
I mean, Ham tends to think that like, oh, the reason Gilgamesh is wrong and the Noah story is right is because Gilgamesh got the wrong dimensions of his boat. It's like
Hmm.
that's the reason why Gilgamesh is wrong is because it is teaching there are many gods. You know, it's the theological things that are wrong. The story itself is a
Yeah.
narrative that can be altered to yeah. So, but yeah, the you can edit this bit because I'm blurbing. The reason why the Gilgamesh story is wrong and the Noah story is right isn't because they got the facts wrong. It's because their worldview and theological teachings are wrong, right? So, I hope
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does.
Yeah.
So one thing that I just found really interesting is why I decided to dress up as this today is the topic of Epicureanism, if I'm even pronouncing that right,
Yeah.
and how um, Ken Ham's understanding of like how miracles work and what is true is
Hmm.
historical facts. That's actually based off of like a certain philosophical tradition, like from Epicureanism, which is obviously something in Greek culture that was way after the biblical text of Genesis was written. So like there's just no way that they would have been reading the Genesis text like that. They would have been reading in their own context. So could you I think it's really important to mention because like when we see something that's like clearly based off of something that was not in the original context, it helps people understand like, hey, okay, maybe I'm looking at this from a different, the wrong perspective here. So could you talk about this idea of Epicureanism and why, or like how that relates to what Ken Ham believes?
Um, that's a tough one. Uh, yeah, basically, a lot of our modern Enlightenment thinking is
Mm,
Epicureanism, and that is basically the belief that uh, the natural world is the natural world, and if there are gods or if there is a god in the supernatural world, they don't touch, right?
mm,
And therefore, and this gets to the idea of what we consider miracles. Um, Basically, it's kind of a deistic idea as well. That if there is a God, and this is kind of what Thomas Jefferson believed. God created the world like a giant clock, that just would run on its own, and the natural laws was how it was run. But then he stepped away, and he has nothing to do with us. That's kind of like if there are gods, they have nothing to do with us. Kind of Epicureanism in a nutshell. And therefore, because of that, we in the modern world, we've kind of assumed that, and we tend to think that God is up here, and occasionally he'll intervene and kind of disrupt a law of nature to perform a miracle, right? He kind of gets in there and whatever. And so therefore, this is a larger, debate, I guess, do miracles happen?
mm,
In the ancient world, in ancient, Judaism, they didn't see the world that way to begin with. They didn't think that Yahweh was literally out here and we're down here, and he occasionally intervenes. Everything in creation, God is the one keeping it going. He's always intimately involved with his creation. And therefore, what we tend to think are miracles as God monkeying with the natural laws, they would have seen as he's not monkeying with the natural law. He's always involved. In just some ways he's more obviously involved than others, so excuse me. And so where am I going with this? Where am I going with this, Zach?
I think you're on the right point there.
Yeah.
So how does that relate to what Ken Ham believes about the young Earth creationist debate?
Oh yeah.
I can edit this out and we can
Yeah,
cut this whole question if you don't.
I'm trying to think of. Oh, it's been a while. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm drawing a blank. Yeah, edit this out. What was the specific part you had in mind in the?
This is the Enlightenment and Heresy of Ham.
Yeah, let me refresh my memory.
I'm gonna put it on the screen actually.
Oh, okay, yeah. Maybe I could give me something specific to.
If you can see it, I don't know if it'll be big enough. All right.
It just.
Let's see here.
Page 156.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. These ones.
I think it's you get to the main points that lower below.
Okay,
this idea of like science, how Ken Ham looks at science, and let's see here.
So if it can't be proven scientifically, then you're denying it's true.
Yep, that's definitely a big part.
Yeah, okay.
And also that, like if it's not historical, then like, it bases our understanding of historical must be true, and anything else
all
is
truth
wrong.
must be historical.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know. I was wandering around aimlessly. I was kind of in the ballpark, but once I get off the rails, I go. What? Okay. Yeah. All right. I'll just you'll edit this. How can I jump right back into it? I'll just say, and so therefore, what Ham is doing is because he's basically bringing a modern scientific mindset to reading the biblical text, which he doesn't realize this, but it's very Epicurean in its mentality, thinking that the natural laws are what makes something true. If you can't prove it scientifically or historically, then it's not really true. And Ham, therefore, he thinks in order to prove the Bible is true, he has to prove it's scientific and historically accurate. Because for him, that's the definition of truth, which is a very Enlightenment Epicurean notion. Like, when he does that, he ends up not understanding what the Bible's doing. That's why he comes up with this. One of his big things is there's two kinds of science: observational science, the things we can, prove, okay, and historical science, which is basically things that we must take by faith that they're scientifically true. And you're like, he's trying to take the Bible, and in order to prove it's true, he has to say it's scientific somehow, where maybe the Bible isn't trying to be scientific. Maybe Genesis 1 through 11, that's not the aim of Genesis 1 through 11, is to give you a scientific account. Maybe it's doing something else. But for Ken Ham, no. It has to be scientific or it's not true, because everything is true. Everything that is scientific, everything that is true has to be scientific. And so it's a little gerbil wheel of Epicurean logic, I guess you could say. And I don't think he realizes he's doing that, because he is such an Enlightenment thinker that the way to prove the Bible is true, or the way to prove Christianity is true, is to prove that everything in it is scientific. And I'm sorry, Christians have been around for 2,000 years, and that's really never been the case,
right?
And so,
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, if I could try to understand it, of course, he would never say Yeah, it's only true if it's historical, or it's only true if it's scientific. He would never say that. But I guess the logic in someone like that, and I've done it in the past, is
Mhm,
that like, hey, it's not meaningful to me if it's not
mhm,
historical, or what it's trying to claim has to be historical for it to be meaningful.
mhm.
But that's just not true. That's not how writing is done. And we even see that in like real world examples. Like we watch movies and we the tortoise and the hare, stuff like that. We tell those stories and say like, okay, that can have meaning even if it isn't historical.
Yeah,
But at the same time, because it's somehow related to the Bible,
we have to make it historical.
yeah, like it
Yeah.
doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense.
No, the example I often give is like, take the parables of Jesus, the parable of the Good Samaritan. The point of that story is to teach what loving your neighbor is supposed to look like. Now, maybe theoretically, maybe Jesus got the idea of that for that parable because he encountered a Samaritan who helped the dude, and it was actually a historical story. But the story itself is not a history lesson; it's a parable, and most people know that. We instinctively know parables are not historical claims. We understand what the parables are. Um, but for Ken Ham, and he would probably even agree with the parables of that, I would assume. Um, but for some reason, with the early chapters of Genesis, he cannot fathom that these accounts, like the creation account in Genesis 1, can't be anything other than scientific. Because if it's not scientific, then you're calling God, and then he goes off into you're calling God a liar and you're saying the Bible's not true. And because it's historical science, which is a term he made up to convince himself that it's true, And so it's baffling to me how it's it's one of the things I've always, to this day, I'll never understand it. Like, because I grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, Wheaton College. I didn't go to Wheaton College, but my parents did. The heart of evangelicalism in the 70s and 80s. I was always fairly conservative, but I didn't know anybody. If I did, I didn't realize it. I didn't know anybody who was like, the earth must be 6,000 years old or it's not, or the Bible's not true. Genesis 1 through 11, that's exactly how it happened, or you're saying the Bible's not true. I didn't know any evangelical Christian who said that, and so when I came across Ken Ham, I was who believes that? And sadly, a significant, I don't know how big, I'm not going to put a percentage on it, but a significant enough portion of the evangelical world has kind of bought into that because they believe that in order to prove the Bible is true, it has to be scientific, which is, I think, just wrong-headed, and you go off in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Yeah. The difficulty about this topic is that people that have grown up in this atmosphere, and when I mean grown up, I mean like literally like, vacation Bible
Yeah,
school, Answers in Genesis. The
yeah,
pastor saying like, hey, if you believe in evolution, you're essentially a heretic, or
yeah.
you're the authority of the Bible is wrong. Like the tactics that someone like Ken Ham uses unknowingly is
Mhm.
just like almost entirely based off of fear of like you're going to destroy everything that is good about the world if you accept this, which essentially means, and he doesn't say it, is that gets interpreted to anybody who's listening as anybody who disagrees with you is evil, is
Yeah.
on the other team, is someone that we should just completely stay as far away as from. So like that's when you get into like the idea of like we can't talk about those other
Mhm.
creation texts from outside the Bible. We
Yeah.
can't listen to other people's views. We have to just like completely shun them. If someone like you who was a teacher for like 7 or so years and did a great job, everybody loved you, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh shoot, like he believes things that he doesn't even talk about in the classroom. Well, he needs to be kicked out
He
because
doesn't
like
believe in
clear,
Ken, he doesn't agree with Ken Ham. He's a
yeah,
sheep in wolf's clothing. Like,
right,
and the sad thing is, and this is, I'll read you this one part in the book. When I had to encounter this headmaster who was pushing me out,
yeah,
um, at the end of our back and forth, we had a bunch of emails back and forth that I gave a snippet of in the book. Um, I kind of called him out on basically what the problem is, and And it ends up becoming, well, let me read this to you and then we'll talk about it, because I think this is very significant. I basically said in this email to him at the end, near the end of going into my last year. And the reason I was allowed to stay a year, because I had signed my contract, he couldn't fire me. And so,
okay.
yeah, he had it. So basically, if you read the book, this book, you find out that the last year, even though he couldn't literally fire me, he was doing a lot to try to get me to quit. And I was like, oh no, I'm just going to stay here and irritate you.
Gave you the bad desks. Like, how petty.
There's another, side thing. There's another thing that happened in the fall of that year. I didn't put it in the book. I don't think I did. Sometimes when you're a teacher, and you have 5 minutes left at the end of the class, and because of the wonders of the internet, sometimes I'd like play them a funny video or something. And in November of that year, Taylor Swift had come out with "Shake It Off." It's a very peppy song, and so at the end of this one class, I played that for them, because it was just "Shake It Off, Shake It Off." Back then, Taylor Swift was like milk toast, country girl, whatever. Anything of it. That night, I get this call from a parent who was clearly drunk, because he was kind of a belligerent guy. And he was like, "Did you play that Taylor Swift song?" I'm like, "Yeah." "I'm going to kick your ass." I'm like, "What?" And he was like really angry that I played that song. And he went the next day to complain to the headmaster, who was already trying to get rid of me. And the headmaster basically called me into his office, and he said, "I'm putting you on probation for the rest of the year. You do one more thing wrong, you're out of here." And I'm like, "You're threatening me? You're putting my Taylor Swift?" Like, I might be the only teacher in the history of the world to almost lose a job over Taylor Swift. And so, but yeah, he was, and I guarantee you, he was trying to like irritate me so much that he was trying to get me to quit. Yeah. But like I said in the book, I'm very stubborn. If I think you're going to try to bully me, I'll just dig my heels in. I'm not going to do anything to annoy you other than just stay.
Yeah.
But anyway, so going into that last year, when it was clear he was going to push young earth creationism onto the school. Ken Ham had a book that we were going to read as a morning devotional. And he was going to push a bunch of other stuff. And when it was clear that he was not, after the year I was leaving, I basically wrote him this email. And I basically said, "Clearly, I know this is what you're going to do." And then this is what I wrote. I said, "I fear that pursuing such a course of action will not only fail to prepare students for successful engagement in the academic world many of them will encounter after high school graduation, but will also fail to reverse the trend of defection by evangelical youth from their spiritual heritage. In fact, it will probably accelerate it." And this was my big point. "If you tell a student that if he doesn't believe in a literal 6-day creation 6,000 years ago, then he can't believe in the gospel and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, then what that student just takes when that student just takes an entry-level biology class and learns just the basic facts about biology, do you know what he's going to do? He's going to completely throw away his faith, because you will have told him he has to. You will have attached the gospel of Christ. You will have attached to the gospel of Christ a debatable scientific claim and an interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11 that has never been universally held in church history. And you will have made adherence to that debatable scientific claim a prerequisite for the gospel of Christ. That is indescribably sad. And that, to me, the reason I wrote the book to begin with can be summarized there, because to me, that's the biggest danger of young earth creationism. It's not that it believes the young earth, whatever, I don't care. But when it does that, when it tells people, if you don't believe the earth is young, then you shouldn't believe the resurrection, a lot of people are going to take your word for that, and they're going to reject the faith. For me, young earth creationism, the biggest danger of young earth creationism is that it is a threat to the historic Christian faith. And we know over the last 8-10 years, There's been a lot of ex-evangelicals who grew up in Christian settings, conservative, who've bought into that stuff and now have completely rejected the Christian faith. And it's a lot of times always comes back to this young earth creationism issue. That's the thing that started them. Okay. I guess, you know, a lot of them are now mythicists. Jesus didn't even exist, because it's like, it's very, very irritating.
Right.
Sad, very sad.
Yeah, I'm not, and I've done videos like going even more detail about how it's not the specific people. Someone like Marcus Ross or Dustin Burlett, who I'm good friends with, they have real good like scholarship that arguing for young earth creationism, okay? Now, that doesn't mean they're right about everything. They would say it themselves that, but they're not like, giving this environment of like, you have to be a Christian. You have to be this young earth creationist, or you're not a Christian or whatever. And that's like super dangerous, as you said. And there's a lot more into that. So someone like you isn't even saying like, hey, you should just throw out young earth creationism altogether. A lot of your arguments are simply just like, hey, like these specific things that Ken Ham is doing is super dangerous.
Yeah. And I make it clear in the book, and I've said it already today. It's not that if you believe the earth is young or you believe in a historical Adam and Eve, I disagree with you, but that's not a core tenet of the faith. I think you're wrong, but you still work it out. It's when you take those things and you elevate them to such a fundamental Christian tenet level, and you start attacking other people who don't agree with you, you create division and hatred and animosity, and people walk away from Christianity as a whole because they've been hurt by you.
Pretty much,
And I think, to me, I remember on a personal story, when that whole thing happened to me in 2014, 2015, when the young earth creationist headmaster kind of ended my career in Christian schools, I'll admit there was a part of me that wanted to lash out and like, well, this all of it's kind of, because when you get hurt, that's your first reaction. Just dismiss it all. But then I couldn't help but, well, there's two reasons. I didn't chuck my faith for two reasons. Basically, one is when I would read the New Testament, and it's amazing. You can read the New Testament and you read it and you know it, but certain things don't pop out to you until certain other things have happened to you. And when I was getting, persecuted for this, I would read the New Testament like on every other page, like either Jesus or Paul or Peter. They're like, if you truly follow Christ, you're going to get persecuted by people who think they're working for God. And you're like, dang it, I can't give up my faith because this is what it just told me. This is what's going to happen, So that was interesting. And then the second thing, it comes from, I'm going to paraphrase it, but one of my favorite novels is called A Prayer for Owen Meany. It's by John Irving. And I won't get into the whole story, but there's a character in it who he's commenting on televangelists in the book, like corrupt televangelists. And he's like, look at these TV preachers and, they're corrupt, but, just because, how do you say it? Like, just because some TV preacher is an a-hole doesn't mean Christianity is not true. And I remember thinking that's very true. You're going to run into certain people who are Christians or call themselves Christians who treat you very badly, who are jerks. It doesn't mean the Bible's not true, or it doesn't mean that Christianity is not true. It just means that one specific guy is kind of a jerk, And so, just because you get hurt by somebody or a church, it doesn't mean the whole thing is wrong. It just means maybe the problem is that person.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah. I think from a mental standpoint, like the unconscious side of things with anxiety and hurt and all that kind of stuff, we're naturally going to want to, as you said, chuck it out. But we also have to be aware of those emotions and how that can affect how we're thinking. So, we don't want to go, just because someone hurt us, go all the way to like mythicism or something crazy.
Yeah. And sadly, a lot of people
definitely does. Exactly. Like it definitely happens. Like it's an obvious effect that happens. It's not that clearly not based on the evidence. There's something else going on.
Yeah, it's an emotional reaction. Like, you hurt me over here, so I'm going to go as far away as I can and the other side and fight you back. And yeah, it's a sad thing when that happens.
Right. Well, I think that's a pretty good way to end it there. Talk about what's the most important there. So I really do appreciate you coming on here. Maybe we'll have you on again to talk about, because you've got a lot of different content in your book that's worth talking about, worth people getting to know about. So thank you so much for coming on here. Your book will be in the description, so everybody check that out.
Yeah.
Everybody check out the website as well, because you're routinely talking about really important, cool topics. You talked about the women in ministry just really briefly recently. You talked about other things that you talked about on my channel. Do what?
On my blog you're talking about?
Yeah, your blog, your website,
Yeah. I used to, back 10 years ago, I would write a lot on young earth creationism when I was writing the book. On the book, I don't write as much about young earth creationism anymore. I try to branch it out into other issues, but yeah. One. I just got to add one thing that I just, if you read this a couple of weeks ago when I did like a 3-part series on that young earth creationist movie, The Ark in the Darkness.
Oh boy.
I totally it did not click for me until I watched that movie how much young earth creationism and end times, Tim LaHaye, Hal Lindsey, young dispensationalism, how connected they really were. And I did not know this even when I wrote the book. Somebody mentioned that Tim LaHaye, the guy who wrote the Left Behind series, are you looking for it?
I've got so many books on end times.
But yeah, I did not know that Tim LaHaye back in the 60s, when he moved to San Diego, he basically funded Henry Morris's what was it, Institute of Creation Research?
Oh, I did not know that.
And who wrote the Genesis Flood, which is really, it came out in 63.
Yeah.
It was like the real start of the modern young earth creationist movement. Tim LaHaye funded it. So like it always, I never understood why so many young earth creationists were also very fervent in their end times views.
Yeah.
Now it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
They really do go hand in glove, sadly.
Yeah, I actually do have a book that I found. It was pretty hilarious, just in like this like garbage bin, basically, of old books. I think it was a church or a Goodwill or something. And it was like end times and creation. It's like, oh, okay, well that explains it all. And it was like Henry Morris.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, I really think that like when it comes to Genesis 1 through 11 and Revelation, because they are two types of, they're not the same genre, but the two types of genre that we in the modern world are unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
So therefore, in this case, it's very easy to take both of them and interpret them literally and historically.
Yep.
But if you understand the original context and the idea of genre, then you realize,
right.
even with modern dispensationalism, when I used to teach Bible and we got to Revelation, I would tell my students, you got to realize that view for the first 1850 years of church history, nobody believed it. It's really from the 1850s to today. That's the whole Tim LaHaye view.
Yeah,
kind of took root. But yeah, I did not. It did not click for me how the close connection between those two.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yeah,
and so, as so many people are so adamant about that specific movie that you're talking about, like it's like you have to accept this. You also have to accept this end times view, and how that connects doesn't make any sense, but it does.
It doesn't make any sense. But that's all they focus on. And it's just like, there's a whole big thing in the middle of the Bible where God gets involved in history and Israel and the church.
Yep.
Maybe that's what we should focus on a little more, but they don't. But it's a sad thing. But
yep. Okay. All right. So maybe I should ask you this. How much time do you have?
I mean, a little more time. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
As far as long as I know, unless my dad calls me and says there's something wrong with Elliot, I'm fine.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, in that case, I might as well ask you. So, let's see here. Oh yeah, I didn't. I wouldn't. This is very important. Okay, so you talked in your book that this is so important that I never realized Ken Ham does. So Ken Ham, you talked in your book how he's on one hand like defending the authority of the Bible. It's like
Mhm.
that's his goal, right?
Yeah.
But clearly he has other goals in mind because
Yeah.
he has huge emphasis. You talked about like in the original The Lie book that he made.
Yep.
Like almost the entire book was based on fighting liberal secularism,
Yeah.
the Democrats.
Yep.
Like the logic is indoctrinate children to believe young Earth creationism is true and evolution is evil. They grow up to be moral people who will thus be able to get positions of influence and power so they can rule the culture. Fight
Yeah.
against divorce, gay marriage, abortion, sexual deviancy, parental authority, so on.
Mhm.
So, how, like, what stood out to you about that? Like, how does that connect to the Genesis topic, and why is that so important for people to know about?
Are we are we live now?
We're still live.
Oh, I thought you were recording this. Oh, we're not really
Oh
live, are
no,
we?
we're not live. No, sorry, we're recording. We are
We're talking
recording.
about- Okay, yeah. Um, all right. How does that relate? Uh, one of the things I noticed when I first wrote the book 8 years ago was how much Ken Ham and young Earth creationists, no matter what they say, and it sounds weird, their real point of concern isn't even how to interpret Genesis 1 through 11 correctly, or isn't even scientific stuff. For them, those things are just battlefronts on the larger culture war. And you just read that part. They think if they can convince people that Genesis 1 through 11 is historical and scientific, then they'll know the Bible's true. And then they'll take these positions politically and socially, and they will rule the culture. And I thought that was really problematic. And I want to clarify, it's not because I'm a liberal. That's one of the things that the young Earth creationist headmaster accused me of, and I'm not. I mean, I'll tell you right now, like I think the Democrat Party right now has gone off the edge, and I hope they come back to sanity. I disagree with them on most things, but what I took issue with Ken Ham about is let's take an issue that is controversial, but not super controversial because it's been around so long. Like take abortion. Ken Ham is against abortion. I am too. I think it's bad. When you look at the church fathers, they're against abortion. But the reasons he gives as to why he's against abortion is wrong. He believes as soon as that sperm hits the egg, it's a citizen. And you're like, I don't know, but he's convinced of it, and that's what he's fighting. Whereas here I'm a Christian. I think when you look at the church fathers, clearly they are against abortion, but at the same time, I live in a culture that is a secular culture that you then as a Christian, I have to think of what's the best way for me to articulate my position, to argue for my point of view in a pluralistic society that convinces more people, even non-Christians, to agree with me so we can make laws that we can all agree on because we're in democracy, right? And so, but Ken Ham doesn't think of it that way. He just thinks if we get Christians in power, then we can outlaw abortion. And he's trying to enforce largely conservative political social values, which I agree with, but he's trying to do it in a kind of a theocratic way. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so in the book, I kind of mentioned that's his real focus is fighting the culture war, which is basically a political mentality. He's not trying to be like Christ, to speak to the conscience of America and to convince people of the truthfulness of Christian morality and whatnot. He wants to enforce it. He wants to do it through political means.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that becomes political idolatry. You're slapping a Jesus bumper sticker on your real political motivations.
Yeah.
And I thought that again, and that's a bad witness. Okay. It's not any specific position you take, but that's that mentality that turns people off. And what I've noticed in the 8 years since the book came out, and this is where I wanted to mention this in the revised edition, but I had to pull back on it because it's so touchy. It has to do with, politics and Trump, is for the last 8 years, I've seen, how can I put this? When the book first came out, I got a pretty good reaction. I met a lot of people who liked the book and that I was warning, about some of this things that going on in evangelicalism. And then Trump ran for president, and a lot of evangelicals and ex-evangelicals, and they freaked out. Again, I didn't like Trump in 2016. I didn't vote for him, but okay, whatever. A lot of people freaked out, and they ended up conflating Ken Ham, young earth creationism, to everybody who voted for Trump and evangelicals and Christian nationalism, and everything got put up into this blender where a lot of people, and this is partly why I stopped writing so much about the creation, evolution, young earth creation stuff. It became so easily it always dovetailed into some kind of modern political debate. Like, how can you, somebody would say Trump is a Nazi. And I'm like, he's a jerk. He's not a Nazi. Like, I can't believe you're worshiping Trump. You were so smart in your Heresy of Ham book. I'm like, two different things, but for them, they conflated the creation evolution issue as well as some other issues into a lot of modern political social debates to where they just demonize the other side, much like Ken Ham demonizes, everybody who doesn't agree with him. If you read my book, when the young earth creationist headmaster found out that I didn't believe the earth was 6,000 years old, all of a sudden I was some dangerous liberal who was trying to force homosexuality into the school, which if you read that story was anything but, but he was labeling me with these caricatures of what dangerous lefties are like.
Yeah.
And then, but what happens is a lot of people who have been hurt by that, they ended up doing the same thing. We're labeling, I'm not even evangelical anymore, but I'm not going to say all evangelicals are crazy white supremacist Christian nationalists. That's silly, but it's so easy to get wrapped up into caricatures and the culture war where you're just throwing bombs at anybody who disagrees with you on any single thing. And I think it's political idolatry, and it's you say far right fundies like Ken Ham do that. But a lot of times, a lot of people who have been hurt by that, they've gone off to the far left fringe, but they still have that same mentality where they think the way to follow Christ is to get involved in politics and destroy the other side. I mean, if everybody's you paid attention to the political stuff, Trump's going to end democracy, end America as we know it. I'm like, you can disagree with them, but he's not the boogeyman,
Right.
And so, but I hear stuff like that. And I remember when I was a kid, every now and then people would say, oh, Democrats, they're all baby killers. Well, not all Democrats are baby killers. There's the abortion issue. There's specific issues you have to tease out, and it's a complex thing. But to just label somebody a baby killer because they don't agree with your specific position, I don't see it. It's much different than what has happened over the last 8 years with, the whole political discourse. I think there's a lot of that happening on both sides, and I think hopefully people are sick of it. But part of the reason I came out with a revised edition, I wanted to subtly kind of tell people that if your politics is becoming so toxic that you're dragging Jesus into it as justification for your demonization of everybody on the other side, you're kind of like Ken Ham. You're using a Jesus bumper sticker to support your own political views instead of letting Christianity inform your political views. It's an upside down thing. And it is a very touchy thing because politics have always been touchy, especially the last 8 years. But it's just so funny. Like, I've lost some friends who were because they thought I was too liberal, but then I've also lost a number of friends because they think I'm too conservative because I won't say Trump is a Nazi. You're like, well, he's not. There's a lot with any politician. There's things you can critique, but
Right.
So I don't. That's kind of one of the things that was. I didn't know how to address it when I was doing my revised version, because you can't address it quickly.
Yeah.
I kind of put little hints on just
Right.
general things like that.
Yeah. You know, you made a lot of really good, strong points, helpful things. What I wanted to emphasize for my audience is that what Ken Ham does is the same, or at least the way he frames things, the way he teaches, maybe he even does it himself,
Yeah.
is that he's basically framing it so that people that, you know, if you do listen to what he says, you'll end up like the professor that as soon as he learned that, hey, you don't believe in a literal Genesis,
The
that
headmaster.
means that you must be homosexual or you
Yeah.
know for
Yeah. Yeah.
homosexuality. Like that's not connected in any way at
Yeah.
all. It literally doesn't make, there's no connection there. But when you listen to the way Ham frames these types of things, what happens is like young earth creationism becomes like this kind of justification for a specific view on politics. And
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
like we can't let that bias go into that conversation, or the headmaster was not listening to anything you were saying because
No.
he saw you as the enemy.
Right.
As soon as that came up, all of those other concepts played into his head, and there was just no getting to him at all, no matter what you
Yeah.
said.
And the more I tried to
Yep.
reason with him,
Yep.
the more in his mind, he's like, oh, you're just like the serpent trying to deceive me. Like he was not interested in understanding.
No.
He had his views, and if you didn't agree with it, I'm going to put my gun on you, metaphorically, and shoot you down. And I think that's what we've seen across the board. And it's, you know, the way I always kind of say it jokingly, like when you find yourself getting shot at by both sides. Hold on, here you go. Right. Here you go. Boom, boom. Here you go. Getting framed. When you find yourself getting shot at both from both political extremes, you realize you're in no man's land where Jesus is. You know. So, but that's exactly right. The headmaster, no matter what you said, I was the enemy, no matter what. And it's very easy, therefore, when you get hurt like that, to then turn around and do the same thing going the other way. And sadly, a number of people have done that because it's human nature. It's human nature to do that. But I think the purpose, and how can I put this? And what I've seen in the last 8 years is the Christian faith getting roped into these political debates. Like it's just a justification for politics. And we have to sit down and think, like, what's the core message, the core goal of Christianity? It's put your faith in Christ so you can become Christ-like, so you can transform into a more Christ-like person. Yeah. If you forget that, if you start thinking, therefore, I'm just going to cherry pick Bible verses to slap onto any political issue I want to justify my political views, you're missing the point of what Christianity is. Now, obviously, your faith is going to inform your social views and your political views, and we might not all agree on everything. But if your faith is not pushing you to be a more Christ-like person, and if you're using it to throw bombs at the other political side, you might need to do some self-reflection, you know.
Right.
And that's something that Ken Ham and the headmaster will probably never do. But, yeah.
But you can, when you're watching this video today, you can, person in the audience. So something else that you made a lot of just really, really helpful points, ways to frame this conversations that we have in here. So Ham says, why would any Christian want to take man's fallible dating methods and use them to impose an idea on the infallible Word of God? Christians who accept billions of years are saying that the man's word is infallible, but God's word is fallible. Once you have told people to accept man's dating methods and thus not to take the first chapters of Genesis as they are written, you have effectively undermined the Bible's authority. I was hoping you would comment on that. What do you think's the problem with that type of framing?
Well, the problem is it carries with it the assumption that Genesis 1 is trying to give an accurate scientific dating method. You know, right there. It's, again, when you understand the genre, that's not what it's trying to do. Now, and yeah, every dating method that we have scientifically, it is fallible. We're human beings. Sure. It's not infallible, but at the same time, you know, when every single dating method points to the earth as being billions of years old, of a certain, whether it's 12 billion or 10 billion, or when they all point in that direction, it's a pretty good guess that it's pretty old. We're not going to figure out the exact date.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas to say that Genesis 1, or just to deny that the earth is 6,000 years old, really that would take you through Genesis with all the genealogy. Well, the early chapters of Genesis. You're not saying that the early chapters of Genesis are fallible. You're saying they're not trying to do science. They're not trying to do that. I think I put it at one point. Did I put this in the book? I know I put it in a blog post at one point. What Ken Ham is doing is by taking those chapters literally, it has to be literal in order for it to be true, when they're clearly more metaphorical and mythological. It'd be kind of like, what would happen if somebody said, in the Gospels, Jesus said he's the light of the world, and therefore that is what proves photosynthesis. You're like, those are two different things. Just because he uses the word light in a metaphorical way does not mean he's making a scientific calculation here. But that's what Ken Ham does with the first few chapters of Genesis. He's like, if you don't believe it's literal history, then you're saying it's wrong. Like, no, we're not saying it's wrong. We're saying your interpretation of it is wrong. And when you understand the original context, you understand what the inspired message is.
Yeah. Yeah. The way he frames those types of things is like, it's apparently Genesis is a dating method.
Yeah. Well, and he gets that from the genealogies, which again, you have to understand how the genealogies work in the context of Genesis 1 through 11. And again, in the book, I kind of go into detail about how they function within Genesis 1 through 11. In a very simple way, you start back to, I think it's Genesis 3:15, 3:16, right after Eve sins, and God comes down and he says, I'm going to put enmity between you and the serpent, between your offspring and the serpent's offspring. Okay. Then right after that, in the next few chapters, you have all these genealogies and you have to pay attention to them. By the time you get up to Genesis 12, at the end of Genesis 11, when you work through the genealogies, you realize that all the bad nations and cities in the Old Testament, Sodom, Gomorrah, Babylon, Egypt, all the enemies of God's people, come from the genealogy of Cain. Whereas the Jews, the Hebrews, come from the genealogy of Shem, right?
Seth?
No. Oh, yeah, ultimately, yeah, it comes with Shem, but Seth, right. The genealogies are not trying to give you historical data. They're trying to show that by the time you get to Abraham, who comes from Shem, who comes eventually from Seth, it's the war of the offspring. The genealogies are showing that throughout which will be Israelite history, God's people comes from the woman through Seth, whereas all the enemies of God's people come through Cain. Now, obviously, literally Cain came from Eve, but because Cain in chapter 4 gave in to temptation and killed Abel, he is metaphorically the serpent's offspring. When you actually look at Genesis 3 and 4, the language is the same. One of the language to denote the woman and the man after the fall is your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. It doesn't mean like you're going to really love your husband and he's going to be cruel to you. That word desire is like, it's a battle of the sexes. Kind of like one of the consequences of the fall is men and women fight each other and men often come out on top. Mm-hmm. Right. And then when you get to Genesis 4, when Cain is contemplating killing Abel, God tells him its desire is for you. It's the same language. You must overcome it. And therefore, because Cain gives into that murderous impulse, he shows himself to be in line with the serpent. Therefore, his genealogy is the serpent's offspring. And you see this conflict in Genesis 1 through 11 through the genealogies, but then that sets the stage for the conflict that you see all throughout the Old Testament between God's people and the surrounding nations. So how do you understand Israel in history in connection to the other nations, the polytheistic pagan nations? It's the war of the offspring. And then what's really interesting, going all Revelation here, when you get to Revelation in Revelation 12 and 13, I believe, John has this vision of a dragon and a woman clothed with the sun, and the dragon is trying to eat the woman's offspring, but it's Christ gets taken up to heaven, and therefore the woman goes off to be safe. And then at the end of, I think, chapter 12, then it says, and the dragon, who is that serpent, goes off to make war with the rest of the woman's offspring. What John is doing in Revelation is he's referencing all that stuff in the Old Testament. And now he's saying the ultimate offspring of the woman is the church through Christ. And what you have for the Christians in first century who are being persecuted by Rome, the beast and that's the serpent's offspring who is fighting against the Christians. It's the war of the offspring is a theme that goes throughout the entire Bible, that starts in Genesis, that you see in Revelation. All that's to say is that's a major theme you have to understand in the Bible, but it gets set up in Genesis 1 through 11, and that's the purpose of the genealogies. All that said is the genealogies are not trying to give scientifically historical accurate information. It's a literary technique to emphasize this truth about God's people in the woman's offspring and the serpent's offspring. That's how it understands world history. That's a long thing. But Ken Ham doesn't see any of that. He just sees genealogies and he thinks, oh, this is just like ancestrydna.com. And that he interprets it literally without any consideration for the literary context of how it functions in the Bible.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it. So if you say that one of the purposes of the genealogy is to contrast this with like the line of Cain and the line of Seth. If that's the purpose, obviously like Cain represents like Satan or the serpent or whatever.
He's not a literal lizard person, but
But clearly the original person, the serpent, did not give birth to Cain.
It's metaphorical, right? Yeah.
Right. So that you could argue that within the text we have an example of clearly not a literal birth of someone. So to argue that all these other instances must have like this person must have given birth to this person, or maybe even if they skip some generations, even then you still can't like say, hey, that person must have descended from that other person.
I
mean, it's really interesting.
The function of the genealogies, it's a literary function within these first 11 chapters to get to this major biblical theme that gets played out in history. But in Genesis 1 through 11, it's setting the stage for it, metaphorically, symbolically. It doesn't mean you add up all the genealogy years and therefore the earth is only 6,000 years old. Like that's not what it's trying to do. And to say that's what it's trying to do, I would say Ken Ham is the one misinterpreting it and twisting scripture. He's not intentionally twisting scripture, but he's misinterpreting it because he's not looking at the context.
So on that context question then, so I think it's John Walton that's argued that there are no other genealogies from outside the Bible in this area of the ancient Near East that have, like real people and then, like a mythical person. I think you can maybe make an argument with the Sumerian Kings list because there's clearly mythical people in there. But I'm curious how you would respond to that, because someone might say, okay, like if we don't have an example of this, then you can't be saying like, hey, Adam was a mythical person.
Well, I think this is where I think is the uniqueness of Genesis 1 through 11, because on one hand, the unique thing about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, obviously most of it, I would argue, starting from Abraham, the emphasis is on history, historical people and events. Now, again, scholars debate on was Abraham or Moses historical? At the very least, and I think there is I think they were, but at the very least, to me, definitely starting in Genesis 12 with Abraham, the emphasis is clearly that of history. You know, Abraham is going to actual geographical places that we know of today. You know, Moses goes through the Red Sea. We know where the Red Sea is. You know, the claims of all those stories are clearly in this world, in history. The emphasis is on history. Now, that is very unique to when you compare it to the rest of the ancient Near Eastern world. The ancient Near Eastern world never really wrote history. All they cared about were the rulers and their deeds. It would be like the king's annals of whether great deeds, and their mythology that the kings used to support their rule, right? Mm-hmm. So all they cared about was the gods and the kings claimed to be descended from the gods, all that stuff. But they didn't care about what we would consider actual history of normal people and nations, timelines, kind of stuff. They saw everything as circular. Okay, that's the point of a lot of the ancient Near Eastern myths were. The unique thing about the Old Testament is that it's inevitable. It's completely concerned with history. It claims that God got involved in history, made a covenant with a real person, Abraham. He really went and brought the Hebrews out of Egypt under Pharaoh. You know, most of the Old Testament is about historical claims. Now, what I argue is, how do you do that? Where does that come from? Where does that come from? The Jews are inevitably concerned with history. So how do you make the jump from that ancient Near Eastern world that was only concerned with myth and get into history? Well, you have to start with where everybody is. And I think Genesis 1 through 11 is in the genre of ancient Near Eastern mythology to deal with express the worldview of the Jews concerning God and nature and man. Mm-hmm. But the very fact that it says God made man in his image, therefore have dignity and worth, that is the justification for why history is important, because history covers the lifetimes of the people who God made in his image, right? And so therefore, Genesis 1 through 11 sets the stage as the justification why we should care about history to begin with. Without Genesis 1 through 11, you won't get to Abraham. That make sense?
Interesting. But isn't that an argument against your position? Because if the thing, if that's trying to set the stage for why history is important, mm-hmm. then wouldn't you want to say that, hey, these genealogies must be historical if that's what it's focusing on?
Well, the thing is, though, I don't think. Well, let's just take the standard belief that not belief. How can I put this? The first 5 books of the Bible, books of Moses. You know, a lot of people think that Moses wrote them all. Now, I don't think Moses actually wrote them all, but let's just go with that. Okay. Or we would either Moses or Jewish scribes in the Babylon. Is it believable that God would reveal to Moses? Here's Genesis 1. I'm going to tell you Genesis 1 through 11. Let me tell you exactly how I created everything. I mean, historically, I'm going to explain to you the historical, scientific way of how I created it. How would that affect the Hebrews as they came out of Egypt? How would that information be beneficial to them? Why would they care? We might care in the modern world because we're obsessed with history because of the Jews. They're, ironically. So we come to those chapters asking historical questions. But I would say back then, they weren't where we are today. Meaning, they had to have a justification in their mythological world why they would even care about history to begin with. So you have to start where they are. So you have to use the genre they're familiar with.
Interesting.
And within that genre, you're like, oh, human beings are made in God's image, and God has a plan to redeem this fallen creation, which entails, ta-da, him working in history through real people. And so we are the inheritors of that interest in history, primarily, I would argue, because of the Jews' Old Testament focus on history. But for them, they needed a stepping stone to get to caring about history. And I think Genesis 1 through 11. I think the example I give is, to quote Shakespeare, if all, was it life's a stage? No, what is it? Oh, all the world's a stage and men are actors, right? The stage and the backdrop is Genesis 1 through 11. It's the mythical worldview to understand the play that goes across the stage. The actual history is the play. The Genesis 1 through 11 is the backdrop and the stage on which the play happens. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Kind of?
right. So
you need the stage in order to get to the play.
The original question was, hey, why would we think that Genesis 5 and 11 would include mythical people if that type of genealogy genre didn't exist, like in these other texts, if we don't have any other examples? Now, someone might say, oh, well, we obviously have very little text of these in general. Like we have the Sumerian Kings list, and maybe a few Egyptian texts, but we really just don't have much at all as far as genealogies go of this genre. But what you're saying is that this type of people needed like a stepping stone, so that the first part doesn't start so it's doing a very unique thing, which I think pretty much everybody agrees on, that this type of literature, the Torah, is very unique in its time period of when it was written. So that it needed a stepping stone, essentially, like people that were used to this mythic type of literature communicating what is true. Like, hey, you need something a little different. We'll communicate what we want to tell you through the mythic literature that says, hey, this is something that's different, and it is also very important. So we got to communicate that first.
Yeah, and another thing, if you understand, and I spell this out in my chapter on Genesis 1 through 11, I think how the whole thing is shaped is, by the time you get to Genesis 12 and Abraham, the narrative in Genesis 1 through 11 gets you to that point. And basically what I mean by that is, in the first, from Genesis 2 to Genesis 5, you have God creating Eden, man, then there's the fall, and then you have some genealogies. And then at the beginning of chapter 6, it's so corrupt, you have the Nephilim, sons of El, right? And because of that, God has to start over again with the flood. So that flood is basically taking things back to the original state of chaos that was in Genesis 1. Okay, so he's starting over. His first attempt to fix things, he starts over with Noah. Then when Noah gets out of the ark, then you have a parallel thing to what happened with Adam and Eve. He's kind of like Adam 2.0. And there's a lot of similar things there. But then there's the whole thing with Ham looking upon his father's nakedness, and Shem and Japheth, more genealogies. Just, it's the same literary pattern. If 1 through 6:4 is kind of like boom, genealogies, Nephilim, then the flood, then you have this thing again, and after some more genealogies, then you have the Tower of Babel, where there's another major screw up. Now, the thing to remember, once you get done with the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, the natural question is, if God has already promised never to flood the world, destroy the world with a flood again, because that failed to cleanse the world, after Babel, the natural question is like, well, what's God going to do now to try to deal with sin and death? And that opens the door to, the genealogies get you down to Abraham. And then as soon as you get to Genesis 12, it's like, okay, this time I'm going to work through that guy and his lineage. You need that literary structure in Genesis 1 through 11 to get you to the point to even care about why did God get involved with Abraham to begin with. Okay. He's getting involved with Abraham and establishing a covenant with Abraham in order to redeem his creation, which from Genesis 1 through 11, we see has been corrupted. Even with a flood, It's still corrupted. So how is God going to bring about
Hmm.
a renewal and salvation of his created order? He's going to get involved in history in this guy's life with the covenant and work his way through history eventually to redeem everything. So you wouldn't understand the significance of the Abrahamic covenant if the stage had not been set in Genesis 1 through 11. Without the stage being set in Genesis 1 through 11, you have no understanding why that historical covenant with Abraham is even important. That makes sense?
Yeah, right.
You need the 1 through 11 to understand the significance of getting involved in history.
Yeah.
And
No, I
plus,
think, yeah.
and I would say, plus, just another thing that should be obvious is once you get to Abraham, well, in Genesis 1 through 11 with the genealogies, you get like in one verse, you're traversing 900 years with nothing, just zoom. And
Mhm.
as soon as you get to Abraham, everything slows down. And in that one life of Abraham, you're given 12, 13 chapters. Why? It's because this is where the history is. This is where we're going to go through details in this guy's life, where everything in Genesis 1 through 11, there really isn't much historical detail about anybody.
Mhm.
So it's the telling of the narrative is very different once you get to Genesis 12, which is
Yeah.
why I think the actual history starts in Genesis 12.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that's really cool. I do want to point out, like, I mean, you don't think it's like it's still not 21st century journalistic,
Oh,
literal,
no,
historical, right?
no.
So, like,
Even the entire Old Testament, even the Gospels, which I think obviously historical, they're history, but they come to us in the form of literature.
yeah,
So there's a
Mhm.
lot of artistic creativity going on.
yeah,
You have to balance the two. They are talking about history, but they're doing it in a literary, creative way.
Mhm.
It's
Right.
not an either or. It's
Yeah,
both.
right. But on the other hand, the Genesis 1 to 11 is much more mythic.
Everything
If
in it
there is,
has
yeah,
connections to other mythology, and there really is. If you're going to talk about history and evidence of history, there just isn't much in Genesis 1 through 11 that you can nail down. Like where is the land of Nod? I don't know. Is whereas with Abraham, even though some people might want debate on whether or not he was a historical person, I think he is. He's definitely traveling to places that we know actually existed.
Mhm.
So
Right.
there's things in the Abraham narrative that really are part of this world and this history. Whereas you go to the Genesis 1 through 11, there's not a lot there.
Right. Right. The people of Moses's time, or the people of the in the exile, they can relate to this idea of like a Moses or Abraham is in this specific area that we
Yeah,
can conceive of, compared to, like, you can't picture yourself in the Garden of Eden,
right.
like
I mean,
of what that would be like.
yeah, I mean, you would say, to be completely honest, no, you cannot conclusively prove historically that Abraham really existed. I mean, we can't prove that.
Hmm.
But when you look at the narrative, we can point to that, yeah, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in the narrative of Abraham that we know where they are. A lot of the stuff mentioned lines up with that time period that we know. There's a lot more where's the camera? A lot more arrows pointing to the realistic possibility of there being historical Abraham. But when you get to Genesis 1 through 11, there's not a lot of arrows pointing to
Yeah.
anything. It's all very ambiguous. And therefore, for me, even if there was a historical Adam and Eve and historical flood, that's clearly not what the writer of Genesis 1 through 11 is really focusing on. Because if he was really focusing on trying to prove that, he would have probably done a better job of trying to prove it. What we get is, given the story we're given, what is being taught to us. And this is why in my book, when I talk about Irenaeus's take on Adam and Eve,
Hmm.
he's not doing it in just a straight up historical proof of Adam and Eve. He's clearly saying, Adam and Eve, this is the human race. This is us. This is who we are. And so, yeah, when it comes to history in general, there's just not a lot in Genesis 1 through 11 that you can really nail down. And if you can't, that's okay. Because that's not, if God really wanted to emphasize that, he would have given us more details.
Mhm.
And I always say, if I'll tell people, like, if somehow theoretically, somehow at one point they were able to, scientists or archaeologists were able to dig up ancient bones and do testing on it, and like, this was the literal first couple. This was Adam. Great. If we figured that out, awesome. That'd tell me there was more to Genesis 1 through 11 than I thought was in there. But we don't have that. What we have is the story. And so how do we interpret the story, and how does that set up the understanding of the rest of the Old Testament? I think that's
I don't even think you would have to change your view on
No.
anything of Genesis if that did happen.
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't really affect the meaning of the story, because we already know the meaning of the story if you understand it contextually. Again, it would be kind of like if there really was a literal Good Samaritan or a literal prodigal son, a historical prodigal son. That'd be interesting.
Yeah.
But you can understand the parable apart from that. And you can understand Genesis 1 through 11 apart from trying to prove it's historical. That's not the inspiration of Genesis 1 through 11 is what is teaching about the human condition. It's not about whether or not it's historical science, you know.
Right. Yeah, that's really, really cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking about that. Obviously, people should check out your book. Just for clarity, so I've done a number of videos that'll be in the description on why you can take Joel's view and you don't have to like throw out like Jesus or sin or the New Testament or whatever, like anything like that. That's been addressed in my videos. So please check that out. Don't just throw Joel's views out just because, and you know, something Ken Ham told you essentially. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on here. People check out your book, and stay tuned for the next time that Joel comes on, because that'll happen eventually.
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of stuff. The Heresy of Ham. Last year, did we do a video on my New Testament Reader's Guide?
Yep.
I know. Okay. Yep. We did this. You can buy that too.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm also trying to get the Old Testament Reader's Guide eventually published.
That's right.
And I'm going to self-publish like a readable paraphrase of some of the early church apostolic fathers, because I think that's just an interesting thing. So that when that comes out, I'll plug that. You can go to my blog, figure it out. So
awesome. Yeah. Right. So one of those times where maybe subscribing to an email newsletter would be a good idea.
Yeah. Well, I know if people sign up on my blog, anytime I post something, they get a notification.
Nice.
So,
nice. Yeah. I'm on the list. I'm on the list, and
cool.
I hate those things. But yeah, thanks so much, Joel.
All right. Thanks.